Good evening from the NewsHour studio. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, an uneven response. President Trump pushing to extend unemployment benefits and suspend payroll taxes as Congress and the White House fail to reach a deal on economic relief. Then the crackdown continues. Hong Kong police arrest the leader of a pro-democracy newspaper in the most high-profile use of the controversial national security law yet. Plus, the pandemic in Alaska, the influx of seasonal workers, and the inaccessibility of remote villages present challenges for confronting the coronavirus.
We knew that there was a matter of time before it did get here, and we just try to hold it off as long as we can.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
When the world gets complicated, a lot goes through your mind. With Fidelity Wealth Management, a dedicated advisor can tailor advice and recommendations to your life. That's Fidelity Wealth Management.
Consumer Cellular. Johnson & Johnson. Financial services firm Raymond James. Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. For more than 50 years, advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Confusion lingers tonight over the legality of President Trump's executive actions to provide economic relief during the pandemic. That comes as Congress remains at a stalemate on negotiations for a larger COVID-19 rescue package. The urgency is mounting now that the number of confirmed infections in the U.S. has topped 5 million. Michelle Cinder begins our coverage.
How motivated is the White House?
Today at the White House, a flurry of questions about President Trump's actions this weekend to bypass Congress and ease the economic pain of COVID-19.
This president, has taken action to alleviate some of that burden, but make no mistake, there's still much more that we'd like to accomplish, but that includes having willing negotiating partners in Congress.
The patchwork of relief measures, made up of 3 memorandas and 1 executive order, were signed by the president on Saturday after talks between all parties broke down.
Democrats are obstructing all of it. Therefore, I'm taking executive action. We've had it. And we're going to save American jobs and provide relief to the American workers.
The president said he would resume additional jobless benefits, but at a reduced rate of $400 per week. The federal government would pay $300 and request already cash-strapped states to foot the rest of the bill. It's still unclear how many states would be willing to do so, and for now, when any benefits would be sent. His actions also included a pause on federal student loan payments until December 31st, and a deferral of payroll taxes for most workers from September through the end of the year. The president said this would mean bigger paychecks for working families, but the taxes will eventually be due, and the move does little for millions of Americans currently unemployed. Finally, President Trump also directed his administration to consider curbing evictions during the pandemic. But the executive order does not necessarily ban them or provide any money to help renters. Democrats over the weekend blasted the president's actions. They questioned their legality and called for a legislative solution. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
It was unconstitutional slop. While it has the illusion of saying we're going to have a moratorium on evictions, it says, I'm going to ask you the folks in charge to study if that's feasible. While he says he's going to do the payroll tax, what he's doing is undermining Social Security and Medicare. So these are illusions. Right now, we need to come to agreement.
Over Twitter today, President Trump claimed his weekend actions had given him leverage in negotiations with Democrats. He said they were now ready to make a deal. And Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said this morning the ball was now in their court.
I think there is a compromise if the Democrats are willing to be reasonable. There is still a lot of things that we need to do and that we've agreed on.
But the prospects for any talks at the moment are still unclear.
And the question is, what more do we know about the president's weekend executive actions and what they might or might not accomplish? Yamiche joins me now, along with our congressional correspondent, Lisa Desjardins. So before we talk about the president's actions over the weekend, Yamiche, there was just some drama in the White House briefing room. The Secret Service asked the president to leave. Tell us what we understand happened.
Well, the president was beginning his briefing talking about mail-in voting in the stock markets, and soon after, a Secret Service agent approached him and said he had to leave. The president then left. He came back a couple minutes later and said that someone had been shot outside the White House. We're not sure if that's outside the gates or outside the building. The point is the Secret Service says that they now have the situation under control. The person has been taken to the hospital. President Trump says he feels very safe, and the briefing is now continuing.
So let me turn now to what the president was saying over the weekend and what Yamiche was just reporting, Lisa. So, of course, we're glad no one appears to have been hurt by what may have been this shooting. But, Lisa, on the unemployment assistance and the president talking about $400 a week, I think the question is, how exactly would this work? And there are still questions about whether it would actually get to the people it's intended for.
Let me answer that last question first, Judy. It is not clear any of this money will get to the unemployed. It will be state by state, and if it goes out, it will take many weeks. So let me break down a little bit of why that is. First, there is the issue that each state must opt in to this idea, and each state must itself contribute $100 per person per week. Many states may not have that money right now. So states have to choose this. Also, they may have to go through some process inside the state. So let's say a state does decide to participate in this. The next issue is that the president is using money from the Disaster Assistance Fund, which is meant for things like hurricanes. But that fund is only so large. And when you do the math, Judy, it looks like, talking to experts and people in both parties, that this money would only last for 5 or 6 weeks worth of these payments. So the third problem, Judy, is if a state does sign up and wants these payments, it is going to take them a long amount of time, most states, weeks to months, to change their unemployment system to get these checks rolling. So, Judy, what could happen here is if a state does accept these payments, does allow it to go to their citizens, it could take them so long to actually get that system going that in the end, there may just be one check and it may come out just as the money is running out. So at best, this is short term, Judy, and for many states, it may not happen at all.
Wow, so much to absorb about that. So, Yamiche, another thing you talked about in your report had to do with evictions and housing. What the president is saying doesn't go as far as banning evictions and not financial assistance. So what is the idea behind what the president said there?
That's right. The idea behind this executive order, he signed 3 memorandas, but the executive order is specifically on evictions. And what the president directs federal agencies to do is to look into the idea of whether or not there can be some sort of relief given to the more than 110 million Americans who are renting, as well as people who have federal mortgages. And in this regard, the president has not set aside any money. So if you're someone who's renting, who's scared that you might be evicted, this right now does not stop your landlord from doing that. Instead, what this is doing is essentially studying the problem. I talked to a lot of people, especially here in Southeast D.C. and in Northern Virginia, where there are a lot of vulnerable people who are infected disproportionately by the virus. Those people are very scared that now that these eviction protections have lapsed, that they could be thrown out. And as of right now, they could still be thrown out unless the president puts more teeth into something else.
Wow. So another piece of this is important, getting a lot of attention, Lisa, has to do with payroll taxes. The president talking about putting them, cutting them, and basically giving people a break for the last part of the year. How would that work, and what does it really mean? I mean, would people actually see a reduction?
That's exactly the right question again. And Judy, again, it is not clear that people will see this money in their paychecks. And here's why. The payroll tax, as many people may know, is 6.2% out of most paychecks. That goes to fund Medicare and Social Security. But, you know, it's not something that we pay as individuals to the IRS. Companies collect that money essentially, and the company is responsible for forwarding that money to the IRS on behalf of employees. So the cut first round goes to those companies, and the companies have to decide whether they will pass it on to their employees or not. One reason they wouldn't do it, Judy, is because under the president's order here, what the president's doing, this money must be paid back unless something changes at the end of the year or soon after. So a company like Amazon, this is billions of dollars. They don't want to hand it out and then have a bill come due next year when we could still very well be in the pandemic. So the thinking is that many companies may not pass on this money, instead may hold on to it because they might just need to give it back again in a few months. So it's a complicated maneuver. And one other note, a lot of comparisons are being made to the Obama payroll tax cut. One difference with that one, Judy, is Congress actually passed replacement funds for that payroll tax cut so that Social Security and Medicare would not lose money. In this situation, there has not been the replacement funds. Instead, it is dependent on companies and essentially employees paying this money back.
So many moving parts here. And just finally, very quickly, Yamiche, I want to ask you about the fact that while this has been going on the president's part, those negotiations on the Hill, people are still looking to see if that's going to produce anything. Is it thought that what the president did is going to cause that to move forward, or what? I mean, what's the effect it's expected to have on the action on the Hill?
Well, the president was very eager to look like he was doing something for the American people because the talks stalled on Friday. The White House had a deadline for themselves to then go it alone. So the president did that over the weekend. Now it seems as though that the talks continue to be stalled. The Senate right now is not expected to be back, as Lisa and I are both reporting. The other thing is there is this feeling that now that the president is saying that this is the thing that will save everything and that will fix the problem, that there is some feeling from the White House that he has already solved this. But the White House is still looking, as well as Democrats, to make some sort of deal. The president today said that Nancy Pelosi and Senator Schumer had called him and were interested in making a deal. They, of course, said that they never called the president. So what we have here is really a stalemate, and the president saying, well, look, at least I've tried to do something here.
So much to follow. Lisa and Yamiche, thank you both for following this so closely. We appreciate it.
Welcome.
So with more than 5 million COVID cases and over 160,000 deaths in this country, many public health voices are contending that the U.S. is essentially at another crossroads when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. This country currently accounts for more than 22% of all cases and deaths worldwide. We want to explore some of these concerns with Dr. Peter Hotez. He's an infectious disease specialist and a pediatrician. He's at the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. Dr. Hotez, thank you very much for joining us again. So when we compare the U.S. with the rest of the world, is it as bad as it sounds?
Unfortunately, it is, Judy. You pointed out 25% of the cases and a significant number of the deaths. So 160,000 deaths so far, and out of the 700 to 750,000 deaths globally. So we are sadly at the epicenter of the epidemic. And despite all the suffering Americans have gone through in 2020, there's still no end in sight. The projections are we're going to get up to 230,000 deaths by October, 300,000 deaths by December 1st. That's from the Institute for Health Metrics. And it continues to rise from there. And not only just the deaths, but the permanent, long-lasting injuries, neurologic injury, lung injuries, and the survivors, vascular injury, heart injury. So this is just an awful, awful disease, and it's taken a huge toll on the American life and economy, and now with the Homeland Security, tragically.
Awful disease, as you say, and so hard to understand when this country is certainly one of the wealthiest in the world. Dr. Hotez, you told us today that you think it's time for a national reset. What did you mean by that?
Well, the strategy has been on the U.S. side, if you call it a strategy, to always have the states out in front, let the states make their own decisions, and the federal government would provide some important support, FEMA support, manufacturing support to provide ventilators and PPE and so forth. And it's a failed strategy. It's failed because we are the epicenter, and we continue to be. We have now, in the last 7 days, we still lead the world in number of new cases and deaths. And my proposal, and others have made similar ones, is that we not only need a reset, but we need the federal government in the lead. We need not only in the back, but actually providing the directives to the states. And that reset has different aspects depending on the state. So for instance, in New Hampshire and Maine, they're doing quite well, and there may not be much to do at all. But here in Texas and in Florida, Georgia, where things are dire, we may need much more aggressive measures, in some parts even a lockdown. And if we can get to that containment level, and there are different definitions, 1 new case per 100,000 residents per day, others 1 per million. What that means, we can then safely open schools throughout the country. We can safely open up colleges, maybe even have sporting events, and have something that resembles normal American life. So we cannot do that now.
So when you say lockdown in some places, what are you saying in some states? What, half the states? I mean, what does this mean in practical terms?
In practical terms, certainly, for instance, if you look at a state like Florida, where the epidemic is raging in North Florida and Miami, there's clearly going to need to be more aggressive measures, possibly a mandatory stay at home. Maybe not the entire state. Same in Texas, where you have very aggressive acceleration in some of the metro areas in South Texas. The point is, you can be a little more surgical than just simply saying we've got to stop all of to lock down the entire nation. There are pieces that will have to lock down, however.
But right now, we don't see moves in that direction. The federal government, we know the president feels strongly this is something that's up to the states. How do you see the wheels being set in motion for this to happen?
Yeah, so you asked the hardest question of all. I've put out a plan about how do you get movement out of the White House to really take this on, and I'm trying every lever I can through the White House, and other colleagues are doing the same. And unfortunately, we have people who then say, well, Peter, Dr. Hotez, I hear your October plan, but we don't need that. I have my November 3rd plan. And I say, well, there is no November 3rd plan. There's a January 20th, 21 plan, which is really more like a February 20th plan. And by then we could have up to 400,000 Americans perish. So it's not an option. We have to find a way to do this now. Otherwise, we already seen what's happened in Georgia when we try to open up schools in areas of high transmission. It will fail. It failed miserably, and it will fail in Florida, and it will fail in Texas.
So what do you say, Dr. Hotez, to those people who say, we understand it's serious, we understand it doesn't look good, but if we don't get businesses open, if we don't get schools open, this country can't function, that some people are not going to be able to thrive if they can't get their livelihood going?
Yeah, no, and I understand that, especially for the essential workers who, physically have to be in the workplace and family-owned businesses and working on construction sites. But in the areas where transmission is still aggressive, we already know we can't open schools. We already know we are not having anything that resembles a normal life anyway. At least if we can do that reset now, by October 1st, we can have I wouldn't say would be entirely normal, but something that resembles that, like they're doing all over the world, like they're doing in Canada and Europe and so many other places.
And if this isn't done, what are the consequences?
We've got the models, and the models are dire. The models say the deaths will continue to climb. The long-lasting injuries will continue. Teachers will be terrified, and appropriately so, about going back to work. And it will not only cause further erosion to the economy, but will reach a point where people feel scared about going outside. And that's when Homeland Security is threatened. So this has to be recognized as a direct threat to our Homeland Security. And right now, unfortunately, the way the White House is conducting its business, it's guaranteeing that our Homeland Security will be threatened. And we don't have to live this way. We can do something about this now and make life much better for all Americans at this point.
An utterly sobering message. Dr. Peter Hotez from the Baylor College of Medicine. Thank you, Dr. Hotez.
Thank you so much, Judy.
Lost prompt. In the day's other news, Chicago police are beefing up their presence in the downtown area after widespread looting there overnight. The unrest broke out after police shot a 20-year-old man who fired at them on the city's south side. Hundreds of people descended on the Magnificent Mile shopping district. They smashed windows and stole merchandise. More than 100 people were arrested. Mayor Lori Lightfoot called it an assault on the city.
What occurred in our downtown and surrounding communities was abject criminal behavior, pure and simple. And there cannot be any excuse for it, period. This is not legitimate First Amendment protected speech. These were not poor people engaged in petty theft to feed themselves and their families. This was straight up felony criminal conduct.
The melee lasted for several hours and left 13 police officers injured. 16 people have been arrested in Portland, Oregon after protesters rioted at a police union building last night. Demonstrators lit a fire inside the structure before police pushed hundreds of people away. 2 officers were injured in the clashes. It was the 70th night of protest there since George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis. In Lebanon, Prime Minister Hassan Diab resigned today, along with his entire ruling cabinet. The move follows a week of protests demanding a government overhaul since the devastating Beirut port explosion. Diab said the unsafe storage of ammonium nitrate, thought to have caused last Tuesday's blast, highlighted long-standing negligence.
Today, we follow the will of the people, to hold accountable those responsible for this disaster that has been in hiding for 7 years, and their desire for real change. We take a step back to stand with the people, to undergo this battle of change with them. We want to open the door towards national salvation that the Lebanese people are taking part in, and thus, I am announcing today the resignation of this government.
Meanwhile, riot police clashed with anti-government demonstrators again in Beirut tonight. The protesters continue to denounce the government's mishandling of the explosion that killed at least 160 and injured thousands more. A political crisis is also flaring in Belarus after Sunday's election that was widely denounced as rigged in favor of longtime President Alexander Lukashenko. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the election was not free and fair. Protesters also insisted it was a fraud after government-sponsored polls showed Lukashenko took 80% of the votes. Alex Thompson of Independent Television News filed this report.
This is Belarus. The police ordered tear gas, stun grenade and beat peaceful protesters off the streets across the country. Several thousand arrested, at least one reported killed, run over by a police vehicle, which the authorities deny. After 26 years in power, this so-called election duly delivered President Alexander Lukashenko yet another reality-defying victory, 80% of the vote. The man who says you have to be born to be president, not elected, who praised Hitler, who denied the COVID pandemic existed, says opposition protests will be crushed.
If you fight against the country, if you try to plunge the country into chaos and destabilize it, even with minor incidents, you will receive an instant response from me. This is my constitutional authority, so why blame me?
The protesters are sheep, says the president, manipulated by foreigners, but he offered no evidence. Quick to congratulate him, 2 more presidents whose commitment to democracy is at best questionable, Russia's Putin and China's Xi. quick to condemn him European democracies. Belarus's opposition candidate has read the message from the streets.
I think we've already won because we overcame our fear. We overcame our indifference to politics. We overcame our apathy and indifference.
Western observers say the last free election here was way back in 1995. This time, the numbers on the streets, not just in the capital, the numbers at opposition rallies, the numbers now arrested, well, it all adds up, some say, to a genuine turning point.
That was Alex Thompson of Independent Television News. Since filing that report, one protester died in Minsk after an explosive device detonated in his hands as he was trying to throw it at police. Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani signed a decree today to release the final batch of 400 Taliban prisoners. The Taliban demanded that they be freed as a condition for long-awaited peace negotiations with the Afghan government. The militant group said that it is ready to restart those talks in Qatar within a week from the prisoners' release. And stocks were mixed on Wall Street today. The Dow Jones Industrial Average soared 358 points to close at 27,791. The Nasdaq fell 42 points, and the S&P 500 added 9. Still to come on the NewsHour, the crackdown continues as Hong Kong police arrest the leader of a pro-democracy newspaper. Alaska faces challenges on multiple fronts in its fight against the coronavirus. Our Politics Monday team break down the federal response to COVID-19 and the upcoming conventions, plus much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
China extended its crackdown in Hong Kong today, arresting a prominent pro-democracy activist and media owner. As Nick Schifrin tells us, it comes as the highest-level American official in decades visited Taiwan to reinforce U.S. ties to the island in defiance of Beijing.
For Beijing, this is what protecting national security looks like, frog-marching a media tycoon through his own newsroom. Plainclothes officers rifling through reporters' papers, and hundreds of police corralling journalists and arresting editors who produce journalism critical of the Chinese Communist Party or CCP. Apple Daily is Hong Kong's largest media outlet, and its owner, Jimmy Lai, an outspoken advocate for democracy, whose arrest was designed to silence a Hong Kong media that until now enjoyed freedoms that don't exist in mainland China, says senior aide Mark Simon.
We take a strong stand for pro-democracy. We don't make any bones about it. Our media is starting to look more like the mainland than Hong Kong of the past.
Many of Hong Kong's freedoms are stifled by Beijing's new national security law. Lai and activist 23-year-old Agnes Chow were both arrested for, quote, colluding with foreign powers, punishable with life in prison. And the law is written so vaguely, pro-democracy advocates fear it can be used against any critics anywhere.
That law will mean exactly what they want it to mean, when they want it to mean it, and when they need to use it. It will also be used if a young college student from Hong Kong stands up at UCLA and starts talking about how much they love democracy and freedom. This is a widespread and an overreaching law that has incredibly draconian implications.
Beijing says it's protecting Hong Kong from protesters who last year turned violent. And last week, Chief Administrator Carrie Lam says because of COVID, upcoming elections that pro-democracy candidates were expected to win had to be postponed until next year. In response, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Lam and 10 other Hong Kong officials and called the national security law a tool for CCP repression. Today, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs called that proof that the U.S. was biased against China.
Current U.S. policy towards China is a strategic mistake, based on a lack of truth and evidence, venting emotions, and McCarthyist bias.
And Beijing announced its own sanctions on 6 Republican lawmakers and 5 leaders of NGOs critical of Beijing, including National Democratic Institute President Derek Mitchell.
It's part and parcel of today's China, where it's not just about what happens in China, but around the world, that they want people to be quiet, about what's really happening. They don't care about law. They don't care about truth. They don't care about abiding by the basic law of Hong Kong.
Last year, Mitchell spoke in Hong Kong and has co-written 3 books about China. He argues under Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party is willing to try and silence domestic and international critics no matter the consequence.
They're going to use their power, and that they will not accept anything that is remotely rights-based or democracy-based in Hong Kong, and keep going until they feel it is squashed entirely. It's very, very sad. We're seeing in our headlines on a daily basis in broad daylight. And it doesn't stop in Hong Kong. We have to recognize that. It can certainly move to the free people of Taiwan.
The fear that Taiwan is next is the backdrop for the highest-ranking U.S. visit in 4 decades. Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar gave a show of support to President Tsai Ing-wen, considered a Beijing critic.
It's a true honor to be here to convey a message of strong support and friendship from President Trump to Taiwan.
Officially, Azar is visiting because Taiwan's a COVID success story, in stark contrast to the U.S. Taiwan's had fewer than 500 cases thanks to quick actions in January like widespread testing and tracing and mandatory masks. But Beijing considers Taiwan a breakaway province, and U.S. support, especially military support, as meddling in internal affairs. During Azar's visit, the nationalist tabloid Global Times reported Chinese planes entered Taiwanese airspace as a clear message. And the clear message received in Hong Kong by the national security law, activists, residents, even business people are now considering leaving.
Information is everything. And this law is telling, especially the financial community, there are certain pieces of information that we're not going to let you have. The ripple effect is going to be significant. It is not just one more cut in the grain here. This is like an axe chop.
Today, after the raid, Apple Daily vowed to continue its work, but it acknowledged that in Hong Kong today, press freedom is hanging by a thread. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
A coming COVID storm. That is how the mayor of Anchorage, Alaska, recently described the pandemic in his city as he announced new emergency orders restricting businesses and gatherings. As Stephanie Tsai reports, the unique geography of the last frontier state has not spared it from the pain.
Removed from other states, mostly wilderness, the pandemic took longer to gain a grip on Alaska. But now it has, in what officials have described as a rapid acceleration and exponential growth in cases. Summer is usually a boom time in Alaska for tourism and fishing, pillars of the economy that some locals worry will now expose them to an unwanted guest, the virus.
As a mother, you're always concerned for the safety of your children.
Desi Bond, who is Yupik, lives in Dillingham, a small town in the Bristol Bay region known for its sockeye salmon. During the summer fishing season, the population of some 7,000 residents doubles with seasonal workers.
My oldest and my youngest have asthma. You're always on the alert, are they okay? Are they healthy? But then to have something come in that's so invisible and such a big threat to our lives and our livelihood, it's been very stressful.
We're going to be, very careful all the way until the end of August, first part of September.
Thomas Tilden is a tribal leader and commercial fisherman in Bristol Bay.
The mayor of Dillingham and I had sent a joint letter to the governor asking him to postpone the fishery, cancel the fishery.
But other local officials, including Dan O'Hara, pushed to keep the fishery open, concerned about the economic hit.
And then you're sitting here and the community is broke, and we create another disaster upon that.
A compromise was worked out, and seafood companies took steps like testing seasonal workers before they could work that so far have prevented outbreaks in Bristol Bay. Not easy in canneries and fisheries where workers live together.
They put gates around their living quarters, gates around their facilities. Got to give them credit for what they did to keep us all safe.
But other coastal fishing villages have not dodged the virus. Hundreds of seafood industry workers have tested positive. In Seward on the Kenai Peninsula, more than a third of workers at an OBI seafoods processing plant tested positive for COVID-19, forcing the plant to temporarily shut down. OBI Seafoods operates 10 processing plants across Alaska, staffed with both seasonal and local workers.
When you look at the remote facilities, like out in Bristol Bay and in the Kodiak Island, the far reaches, those are closed campuses. They don't leave, they don't interact with anyone in the communities.
Mark Palmer is CEO of the company. He says they work with local officials to keep tabs on any employees who test positive.
Where you have some local workforce, those employees come and go back and forth to home every day. So they're certainly not required to stay on campus, but we try and keep them as separate as possible inside the facilities.
In addition to fishing, the tourism industry is vital to Alaska's economy. Cruise ships bring in $1 billion a year.
We went from that to, of course, almost nothing.
Vivian Mork owns Planet Alaska, a gallery that sells native-made goods in downtown Juneau. 1.4 million cruise tourists were projected to come through the port this summer before coronavirus canceled cruises.
We went from maybe doing well to all of a sudden trying to figure out how to keep the roof over our head and the food in our belly and the store open and bills being paid.
That loss in business has meant a huge drop in income for many Alaskans.
At the same time as it hits us economically, it also helped to protect us, being inundated with positive cases.
They are far from being inundated, but cases have begun seeping in to even the most remote communities where there is extremely limited access to health care. Patients have been medevaced from places like Bethel in far west Alaska and Fort Yukon near the Arctic Circle, home of the Gwich'in people.
We have lost our first tribal member, community member to COVID a few days ago.
Tribal Council member Dacho Alexander says they did their best to keep their town isolated, but village and family life are remarkably interdependent, especially during the crucial peak fishing months.
The reality of village life is it requires multiple families in order to basically survive because you're having to put away food for the winter. We knew that there was a matter of time before it did get here, and we just try to hold it off as long as we can.
It's not clear how the virus got to Fort Yukon. The village was under a strict lockdown and curfews, but for a 10-day period in June when rules were relaxed.
Rural areas are intertwined economically with the larger communities.
Nathan McCowan is head of the St. George Tana Village Corporation. St. George is an island in the middle of the Bering Sea.
Once it gets into the rural communities, everybody understands the capacity and the medical realities about how dangerous it can be.
We're seeing some larger events occur now.
Dr. Robert Anders is the medical director at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. He says many Alaska Natives are at greater risk for severe impacts from COVID-19.
There's an increased burden of chronic disease, increased burden of smoking, increased burden of crowded housing, increased challenges with water and sewer access, and all those prevent incredible risks to the rural community.
Native Alaskans have survived in the face of many hardships, but not without taking devastating losses. The 1918 Spanish flu decimated many families, including Thomas Tilden's.
Apparently someone brought that influenza into the village. One morning, there was no more relatives. They had all died that night. And so they lost a vast number of their village people.
That pandemic killed more than half of adults and elders across Alaskan villages. More recently, the 2009 H1N1 flu hit the region hard. Alaska's geography is both an opportunity and a vulnerability when it comes to COVID.
We want to rapidly identify and eradicate COVID in these rural communities, not a mitigation strategy. We really need to prevent it entering those communities.
But an eradication strategy may be too late. And when the summer fish harvest is over, Nathan McCowan worries the cold season brings new peril.
We can have seasonal storms that will ground all air travel for weeks.
By the numbers, Alaska has far fewer cases than other states, but Desi Bond says the burden is no different.
I know Alaska is a forgotten state. I know our people are overlooked, but we are here. We too are fighting to keep ourselves safe, to keep our families healthy.
Fighting an invisible enemy as memories of devastating pandemics loom large in the minds of many Alaskan Natives. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai.
We are just 1 week away from the start of the Democratic National Convention. And for the first time in months, all eyes are on former Vice President Joe Biden. Our Politics Monday team is here to mark the moment. That's Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report and host of Public Radio's Politics with Amy Walter. And Tamara Keith of NPR. She also co-hosts the NPR Politics Podcast. Hello to both of you. It's great to see you on this Monday. So, Amy, all eyes are on Joe Biden. He's been able to let Donald Trump have most of the spotlight for almost all the time. What kind of pressure is on Joe Biden at this moment?
Yeah, Judy, up until this point, the race has really not been Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. It's really been Donald Trump versus not Donald Trump. Now, part of the reason that Joe Biden also hasn't gotten a lot of the spotlight is Donald Trump doesn't see enough of it, right? He likes being in front of the cameras, constantly having that level of attention. And so in order to make the race a referendum on Joe Biden, he's got to give Joe Biden time to get in front of that camera. You're right that this coming week, we're going to see a lot more in the next 2 weeks of Joe Biden. And I think the most important thing, Judy, is that he answers the questions that a lot of voters have about him. One, what are his priorities? He's been giving speeches, he's been doing stuff from Wilmington, but there's never been a real intense focus on who he is and what he stands for. And then, of course, who he picks as vice president and how that rollout goes. Does it go over among Democrats very well? How does the media portray it? How does he look and sound introducing this person in what will be his very first big decision that he's made as a candidate?
Tam, how do you see the expectations on Vice President Biden? I mean, you hear the Republicans trying to make light of him, saying he's been hiding in the basement. Now is his chance to come out.
Yeah, and that hiding is by design. There have been numerous opportunities where Joe Biden could have tried to get in on a Trump news cycle, and the Biden campaign purposely did not jump in on that news cycle, in a way not taking the bait. And that's a contrast with past people who have run against President Trump. One question is, there is so much other news happening right now. Will Joe Biden and his running mate be able to dominate the news? Will they even be able to dominate the political news? And part of that may depend on how negotiations go over these coronavirus relief packages. And the potential exists that Biden and his running mate don't get as long a news cycle as one normally would. And what does that mean? It's not clear.
Well, we know it's going to be a woman, Amy.
Yeah.
So talk about what's riding on? How much is riding on?
I mean, I think Tim makes a really good point about they might not get the whole cycle to themselves. In some ways, to me, that would suggest that it was actually a good pick politically for Joe Biden, because it's not raising the level of controversy that would keep it in the news for more than a couple of days. What seems to be writing on it is this. He has said, yes, Judy, he's going to pick a woman. But over the last couple of weeks, the impression is that he's going to pick a woman of color. And you've seen so many women who have been brought up on the national Sunday shows, who've been getting full profiles in national newspapers. I think that the expectation has been raised so high that this woman that he picks will be a woman of color, that if he doesn't, that becomes much more of the story, and that the president spends, that Vice President Biden spends most of his time in rolling this out, explaining why he chose someone who's not a woman of color.
So given that, Tam, the pressure's on him to do exactly that, which may be his inclination anyway.
Well, and just to add to what Amy was saying, there have been numerous open letters with very big names and long lists of them urging Biden to pick an African-American woman. And as Amy says, there's a decent chance that if he doesn't, that is what the conversation will be all about. One thing that I think that we don't fully know the answer to at this point is there have been two other women on the Democratic on the ticket before as vice president. And in both of those cases, they ended up getting picked apart in the press. And you know, some of it was based on real holes in their resume and real problems, and some of it wasn't. And you know, what I have to wonder is what happens when another woman is on the ticket. What happens? Do the same sort of sexist tropes rear their head again? And what we know is that the Biden campaign is fully expecting that and seems to have a plan to try to combat it.
Well, we are going to know in coming days. We are told we're going to see the announcement sometime this week. But very quickly, in the time we have left, Amy, the COVID relief negotiations have gone nowhere on the Hill. The president came up with his executive orders and actions over the weekend. Where do you see the political play here? Who's benefiting and who isn't?
Right. I mean, the big danger for both parties is that this completely falls apart and everybody ends up looking bad. It's interesting, Judy, if you go back in April and May, Gallup recorded the highest job approval rating for Congress in the last 20 years. It's down to 18% in July. So certainly Congress isn't going in with a whole lot of deep well here of goodwill. But look, I think Republicans are much more on the defensive, especially in the Senate, because so many of them live in states, especially blue states or purple states, where the arguments that Trump and Republicans are making in the Senate just aren't going to fly there. They do want to be able to campaign on bringing home money to, especially to these state and local governments who are struggling right now, and many of them are struggling with financing things that voters care so much about, education.
And Tam, how do you see the politics shaking out here?
Yeah, I mean, the other big risk here is if they can't come up with something. People have already lost unemployment benefits. Now the president is talking about trying to create a way, but already states are pushing back, saying that it's problematic. They don't have the money, that it's going to be logistically challenging. The Treasury Secretary is saying it could take a couple of weeks, and that may be optimistic. All the while, there is economic suffering. And the real risk is that the economy ends up suffering further while this political fight goes on, and that the ground shifts underneath both Democrats and Republicans.
None of this is happening in a vacuum, as both of you are pointing out. Tamara Keith, Amy Walter, thank you both.
You're welcome.
Finally tonight, as more institutions across the country start to reopen and some close again due to spikes in the coronavirus, we look at how the 173-year-old sprawling Smithsonian Institution is gradually welcoming back the public. John Yang visited two of the key attractions of the world's largest museum, education, and research complex. This report is part of our ongoing arts and culture series, Canvas.
Hey, thank you. It's reopening day at the National Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, outside Washington, home to some of the greatest exhibits of air and space travel. There's no crush of thousands of visitors as there would normally be this time of year. Instead, an orderly, timed entrance of no more than 1,500 people, the daily limit of advance tickets available online.
They just scan it and you'll be good to go.
The same day, under a morning rain, animal lovers trickled into the Smithsonian's National Zoo in Washington. These two sites are the tip of the spear for an institution that has more than 150 million artifacts and works of art, and each year usually attracts more than 30 million visitors.
Our secretary, Lonnie Bunch, has described our opening and closing more like a thermostat or a switch that we can turn up and we can turn back down.
The Smithsonian's 19 museums are free to the public. Officials say these two facilities are uniquely positioned to open first. Steve Montfort is director of the National Zoo.
We have a large campus, 163 acres. Mostly it's an outdoor experience. We do have indoor houses, but we can restrict access to those. So the idea was if we can provide enough social distancing, we can mandate the use of masks.
Following guidelines and regulations from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the District of Columbia, the zoo is admitting no more than 5,000 people each day with timed entry passes from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. On an ordinary summer day, the zoo could have as many as 25,000 guests. Now every visitor 6 and older is required to wear a face covering. The pandemic has also meant changes for the zoo's permanent residents. Associate Director Brandy Smith oversees animal care.
Talk about what it was like here for the months that you were closed. Did the animals' behavior change at all with people gone?
Well, the animals definitely notice that people aren't here. I can tell when I'm out in the park, when I walk by, say, the lions and tigers, they definitely pay attention.
They perk up?
Well, I think it's two things, right? So they're not used to seeing people. So when a person comes by, what are they doing here? What do they have to offer me? Also, I think sometimes, the animals like seeing us as much as we like seeing them. So we offer them entertainment and distraction.
Another concern, the possibility that the animals could catch the coronavirus from people. Even in normal times, some zoo workers wear protective gear to prevent what are called zoonotic diseases, which are shared between animals and humans.
Zoonotic diseases are not a new thing. They're something we deal with all the time. Think about avian influenza, think about rabies, think about E. coli. So we are always prepared to deal with and prevent zoonotic viruses.
First day visitors said they came to get out of the house and see both animals and other people.
What brings us to the zoo?
Nick Chauvenet brought his daughters Maya and Sonia.
We've been doing some nature trails and going to playgrounds, things like that, but they usually like coming to the zoo, so getting a chance to come back after a while, it's been nice.
Does it give you a sense of normalcy if you can out there?
A small amount, yes. It certainly feels like little tiny progress.
We have been waiting all summer long for the zoo to open.
Three generations of the Vandertime family wanted an interesting environment for baby Hendrik.
He was fascinated by the elephant over here.
You feel like that's important education. It's not just get out in the fresh air.
Oh, sure.
He just froze when he saw the elephant. He knows what an elephant is, and now he's connecting that book is a real thing.
What's that?
That's gobsmacking for a one-year-old.
Air and Space Museum Director Ellen Stofan says the Udvar Hazy Center can offer a hopeful message.
This museum is about these stories of ingenuity, stories of creativity, overcoming huge problems. And to me, that's a message that maybe the public could use right now is look what we're capable of.
Last year was the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and that sort of resurgence of that spirit of that summer of 1969, which I certainly remember. And now this summer, which is quite different.
We've been thinking about that a lot because last summer we went all out and projected a Saturn V rocket on the Washington Monument and even launched it up the monument. How do you give that spirit to a new generation that as Americans we can conquer any challenge we put our minds to? And so obviously, even though we're not celebrating as much this summer as we were last summer, that message of the American spirit, American ingenuity, we have our Apollo 13 face mask that has failure is not an option on it.
For 90-year-old Wallace Coates of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and his extended family, seeing was believing.
I do appreciate a chance to see this technology that went behind this science. And I also like seeing that the museums are surviving and adapting.
Though funded mostly by Congress, both museums have lost millions of dollars in parking fees and sales of food and souvenirs. That's as much as 40% of their yearly revenue. But just as important to officials is returning to Smithsonian founder James Smithson's mission, the increase in diffusion of knowledge. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm John Yang in Washington.
So great to be able to go see the animals again. And a quick news update before we go tonight. As we reported earlier, President Trump was asked abruptly to step out of the White House briefing room by a Secret Service agent after a shooting occurred just outside White House grounds. The president returned to his briefing minutes later. He said he believed a suspect was armed and that shots were fired by law enforcement. A man has since been taken to a D.C. hospital to be treated for undisclosed injuries. And tonight on the PBS NewsHour Online, how is the pandemic affecting the 2020 elections? We're looking for your questions ahead of the Democratic and Republican national conventions. You can ask us by filling out the form on our website. That's pbs.org/newshour. And before we go, I just want to note that it's nice to be back in our Washington studios tonight for the first time in some months. We are here preparing for special coverage of the convention starting next week during this important election year. We are continuing to practice social distancing. We're being careful, and we hope you are as well. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again right here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
Since our beginning, our business has been people and their financial well-being. That mission gives us purpose and a way forward, today and always.
Johnson & Johnson. Consumer Cellular. The Kendeda Fund, committed to advancing restorative justice and meaningful work through investments in transformative leaders and ideas. More at kendedafund.org. Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission.
The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, driven by the promise of great ideas.
Supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.